Welcome to the first of the School of Transnational Law's New Law and Sustainability Colloquium, which will be a series of virtual events examining current questions and developments in the broad nexus of law and sustainability. So topics such as the global response to climate change, such as the protection of the biodiversity of the high seas. And we'll be hearing from some of the leading scholars and practitioners of environmental law, but also more broadly than that, law and sustainability. My name is Stephen Minas. I'm a member of the faculty at the School of Transnational Law at Peking University, and I'm delighted to welcome everybody who is joining us for this first event. And in particular, to welcome our first speaker, Christoph Schwarte, who is the Executive Director of Legal Response International, LRI, which is a London-based charity that provides free legal advice to developing countries, to civil society stakeholders in the context of the United Nations climate negotiations. And indeed, Christoph is here today to talk to us on the topic of international climate law and negotiations in the times of COVID-19. Now, after Christoph's presentation, he's very kindly agreed to answer some questions. So if you do have questions during the presentation, please write them into the chat box and we will try to address them afterwards. But Christoph, you are very welcome.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and hello everyone. Thank you very much for having me, and stay tuned. Before I start my presentation, Stephen has asked me to say a little bit about the LRI, the organization we are a network of lawyers from law firms, solicitors from law firms, yes, barrister chambers, universities, that provide free legal advice to developing countries in and around the climate negotiations. And we do that with their help, and they do this on a pro bono basis. Unfortunately, I cannot change my slides. Is there anything we can do about this?
Yes. I'm hoping that while Christoph is speaking, our colleagues at the law office will be assisting with the slides. Thank you.
I think this looks promising already, but thank you. So we provide legal advice around the climate negotiations. Traditionally, this legal advice has always been related to international law. Increasingly, countries are looking at how to implement the Paris Agreement, and therefore we're also advising on domestic law. And we are currently funded by the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BASE, as part of their Climate Ambition Support Alliance that seeks to strengthen the input that small countries, vulnerable developing countries in particular, can make into these negotiations. And in particular, of course, the COP in Glasgow at hopefully the end of next year. If you want to find out more, check out our website, legalresponse.org. We have a database. All the advice that we produce is posted to that database. It's peer-reviewed, totally neutral, and we really do not have a particular policy agenda. I often get asked, why do the law firms and the lawyers support us for free, pro bono? It's very much part of their traditional ethos, but it's also a great learning experience for a lot of younger lawyers. And these days, the ranking of law firms also takes into account the number and quality of pro bono projects. So there are various reasons. And before I start the presentation, I could probably also say something about myself. I qualified to practice at the bar in Germany, but found almost immediately a job in the UN system, so never looked back, but soon realized after about 6 or 7 years I wasn't really civil service material, so I then moved into the so-called third sector, the NGO sector, and have been working on international environmental law with different hats for probably the last 25 years. My presentation, I've called it International Climate Change Law and Negotiations in Times of COVID-19. There was a bit of an academic debate recently whether there is already a body of law that we can refer to as climate change law. I don't want to weigh in on this, but saying, you know, the body of international law related to climate change seemed a bit clumsy. So I'll be talking about climate change law. And I also can't really say there have been a lot of changes in the substantive law yet, but I think there are a number of trends, and I would like to highlight these in the area of human rights and climate justice, economics and trade, the international climate change regime, and here I will distinguish between the substantive norms, the substantive rights and provisions in the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and the more procedural questions. How does COVID maybe affect the negotiations? And then, if we have time, I will attempt a brief look into the future. So, my take on all this is probably very much influenced by where I live and also the work I do. So I think your perceptions might be sometimes very different, but I think we can all agree that COVID-19 has had significant impacts on our civil liberties, political rights, the right to assembly, the right to go out, and the freedom of movement in general. But I think it has particularly an impact in the climate change context on social rights, right to life, physical and mental integrity, privacy, home and family, food, water, housing, sanitation, and so on. And in all these areas, the impacts of COVID-19 now, but also the economic long-term impacts, will accelerate, will strengthen the existing threats and impacts on our lives and our human rights. But there are also very many different local responses, and I think that human nature is resilient, and there are groups and communities everywhere who get together and, you know, find their own ways of addressing these challenges. I think there's also a shift now towards digital tools and communication, but I think what you're probably more interested in is the legal dimension of it all. And here I would, for instance, recommend to look at the work of some of these bodies and institutions, the Human Rights Council, or formerly the Human Rights Commission or Committee, has looked at the rights of climate change refugees, for instance. There is a very recent complaint to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. The American Court of Human Rights has delivered, I think, 2 or 3 different advisory opinions that all touch on human rights and the impact of climate change. The Philippines Commission on Human Rights has looked into the responsibilities of large companies, fossil fuel companies, for human rights violations. And then there's the whole area of climate litigation, for instance. Here in Europe, there's been a case brought by the Uganda Foundation, and there are now similar cases in, for instance, the German courts, the French courts, the Spanish courts, all around individual rights and how they are threatened and already impacted by climate change. And all this will also, have, or it'll become stronger in the future. And it would be interesting to know if there are any such cases in China yet. So if you want to write a paper about this, or you have some research, I'd be happy to distribute that amongst the growing community of lawyers in our part of the world who looks at the potential of cases and legal campaigns around climate change. And I would recommend to have a look at the climate case chart by the Sabine Center for Climate Change Law in Washington that, I think they're based in Columbia, New York, that monitors all these cases. The big issues that I think are still pending and require a bit more work and research relate to the extraterritorial application of human rights. Human rights are usually safeguarded and protected by the state under whose jurisdiction the individual is. That's problematic in the climate change context, where emissions in one end of the world seriously affect the lives and livelihoods of people in another part of the world. Forced displacement and migration as a result of COVID-19, that'll become, I think, even more of an issue. People need, for economic reasons, leave their homelands, move somewhere else. Do we establish a system of treaties between host states and others? Is there maybe a need to issue a new kind of refugee pass? And then, of course, climate change response measure. There is a number of large renewable energy projects, for instance, dams in sub-Saharan Africa, that will have serious human rights implications. But a lot of people also consider this situation we are in as an opportunity to do things differently and to recover in a more sustainable, greener manner. And the Secretary General of the UN, for instance, has put out 6 principles to recover better in the future. So that money is spent to deliver new jobs and businesses through clean and green transition. And when taxpayer money is used to rescue businesses, it must be tied to achieving green jobs and sustainable growth. There should be a move away from the grey economy, the informal, not regulated economy, towards a more green economy. And then public funds should flow to sustainable sectors and projects. Fossil fuel subsidies should be phased out completely. And think about this one in the climate change context. Polluters must pay for their pollution. Climate risk and opportunities must incorporate it into financial system. And I think the last one is a bit of a no-brainer. We need to work together as an international community. What this could look like in practice is that the EU, for instance, as part of their Green Deal and Next Generation budget, has committed to that at least 30% are spent on climate relevant projects and programs. And as part of their Green Deal, they've also suggested that once again, there could be some kind of carbon border adjustment mechanism. And they've very carefully worded this as in compliance with World Trade Organization rules, because that's always, of course, the balance parties need to strike between free trade and climate change response measures. Whether they've put that into the proposal to challenge the US at this stage, I don't know. We will see what comes out of it. Debt relief for vulnerable countries is a big issue. The G20, I think, has suspended all the debt repayments for vulnerable countries until the end of the year. And there is a number of initiatives to cancel foreign debt altogether. And there will, of course, be legal challenges, probably around human rights again. And I've already read that I think lawyers in the Netherlands will challenge support that the big airline KLM is likely to receive. And I think there's similar initiatives here in the UK. But let me zoom in on the climate change regime now. Here, I think it's important to remember that, of course, we have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change with a specific mandate to address climate change, but there are also many other international fora where climate change is a big issue. And to mention just a few, the big announcements are now often made in the UN General Assembly, and the Security Council, I think, has two or three times met now in order to look at climate change as a potential threat to peace and security. The International Maritime Organization, the IMO, has very much addressed climate change by looking at technical regulations, better designs for vessels. The International Civil Aviation Organization has recently established a market mechanism, and because of COVID-19, the basis or the baseline to assess airlines in the future has been shifted. So there, COVID clearly has an impact on existing legal law and governance framework already. So instead of 2019, 2020, that's now 2019 only. And then there are others, of course: transboundary air pollution, the law of the sea, biodiversity, UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And I think you will probably cover a lot of these issues as part of this lecture series. But to move on to the UNFCCC in particular, it was adopted in 1992, along with other Rio conventions, entered into force in 1994. It's actually quite a short, readable convention, unlike, for instance, the Law of the Sea Convention, which has, I think, over 300 articles, 2 annexes. The convention, the UNFCCC convention, is very much a framework convention, and parties soon realized that without specific targets, very little would happen. So they adopted the Kyoto Protocol, which has specific targets for the early industrialized Annex 1 countries. The Kyoto Protocol had a first commitment period for these countries until 2012, and then there is, or was supposed to be, a second one, 2013 to 2020. That was determined as part of the Doha amendments, so-called second commitment period adopted. But until very recently, I mean, in fact, until now, these amendments have not entered into force. This will happen pretty much on the last day of the year, because it takes 90 days for these for the amendments to enter into force. Once 144 states have ratified the amendment. So you can look all this up in the relevant texts. The Paris Agreement was subsequently adopted in 2015, and it entered into force in 2016, the withdrawal of the US became possible after exactly 3 years. They did this, and the withdrawal has entered into effect today. This is also all specified in the agreement, and I would really recommend to have a look at it. We, my organization, under the ECBI, European Capacity Building Initiative umbrella, published a little pocket guide. You can download that. And what is probably important to know about the Paris Agreement is it's, of course, a formally binding international treaty. Initially, the idea was to cover all areas addressed under the UNFCCC, under the guiding convention, in an equitable manner. So not just mitigation, not just the reduction and control of emissions, but also adaptation, technology transfer, capacity building, and so forth. The convention does it, but it's very much focused on. And to date, the international community has very much focused on limiting the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees, and to pursue efforts to stay towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. But there are also 2 other goals spelled out in the provision: to strengthen the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and become more climate resilient, and making finance flows consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development. And here in C, I think it's clear that we're supposed to move away from fossil fuel energy and invest in low carbon growth, for instance, and sustainable development. But there's also an element that says, because of the history of that provision and the fact that it says global response, that I think makes it very clear that it also has to be a shift of investment from the global north to the global south. And these are just a few images from the negotiations. This is the regular meeting place in Bonn. Here, that's a meeting in Vienna when 190 parties-ish started reading through the text on, or the first iteration of the text on the Paris Agreement. These are the iconic moments that you might remember. This is a bubble when everyone gets together in order to hammer out a deal, but there's also that happening around these meetings. There are always a few protests out there, and when I first started going to the climate change conferences, they were very much technical intergovernmental meetings. Now they've become much more like trade fairs. This is what a list of participants looks like. You see altogether over 20,000 people, and this Madrid, December 2019, was a small meeting because it was moved at the last minute from Chile to Madrid. And these negotiations are characterized by multiple strands of discussions, informal and informal settings. You have different negotiation groups for smaller parties, smaller delegation. It is very much a challenge to follow everything that's going on. They also have very different resources at their disposal. They can call a lawyer or not. And the main challenge for reaching decisions often is that decision making takes place by consensus only. So it's quite a convoluted process. If you want to get a first-hand impression, check out the UNFCCC website and some of the negotiations. In the pandemic, we do not meet physically anymore. that's obviously changed. And the secretariat staff, as most of us, is working from home. Or the technical meetings of committees, the WIM, the legal and technical experts, they still meet, but it's all virtual. And the other meetings, consultations, coordinations, this all happens in the virtual space, which can be a big problem for instance, some of the African delegates who have to rent a hotel room in order to get proper Wi-Fi for the day. But it's all just informal negotiations. The decision clearly is that there can be no formal negotiations and no decisions. So that has to wait until next year, when there's hopefully a meeting in Bonn again of the subsidiary bodies, and then one at the end of the year in Glasgow. What we expect is that there will an agreement around Article 6 on market and non-market approaches. That's one of the areas that wasn't decided in Katowice as part of the rule book or the implementation rules, whatever you want to call it. And then in order to meet the overall goals, of course, an updated nationally determined contributions. Parties are expected to do this in 2020. Very few have done so far. So we are looking forward to next year. There are also areas where the COVID-19 situation is reflected. The IPCC assessment report, that's the report of the International Panel on Climate Change, the governing scientific body, will include a review of links between pandemics on human pressures on the natural environment. And then, very importantly, the UNFCCC budget for the next 2 years has to be adopted next year at some point. So I think at least that is an area where they will find a way to take a decision. So what are the not so obvious things to expect? Well, difficult to say. I think as a result of the whole COVID-19 pandemic, we might see completely different dynamics in the conferences, and there might be slightly different alliances. I think, frankly, your guess is as good as mine. I think there'll be more pressure from outside on the negotiation process. And that's also, I think, a result of the many legal campaigns. Question mark behind my point on US participation. I was all prepared to say how a new US government might come into the fold again. It's pretty straightforward. They have to ratify the convention and then the Paris Agreement, and then it takes 30 days to take effect. But the US have often stayed outside international agreements, and although Biden has, I think, very clearly said that he will rejoin the Paris Agreement, I don't really know enough about American politics to say whether that'll also happen. And I think it's been a bit of a mistake in the past to always bend over backwards in order to accommodate the US. So it might also be that they decide on joining in another way, or we'll see. I think overall the jury is still out there whether, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we'll see significant emission reductions, or maybe or not, then, but what's already certain is that a lot of the scientific information we need the collection of that information will be delayed as a result of the pandemic. And I also wonder if, as a result of the pandemic and the increased use of modern media, there'll be a different way of decision making. For instance, to date, the rules of procedure in the UNFCCC process have not been adopted, and that's because parties could not agree on whether there should be voting or not. And I think that's probably very much the basis to create a more modern, maybe partially web-based process of decision-making. I've suggested to our friends, as part of training workshops and capacity building work that we do in some developing countries, to adopt a bit more of a light contact approach. And for those with a background or a bit of experience in martial arts, I'm not talking about light contact and sparring between the US and others. It really is just an attempt to maybe move some of the debates that could take place virtually quite easily out of the final decision-making process, and then maybe have just one day of focused meetings, with masks and all that, to finally come to the conclusions and hammer out the final text. But I think that'll be a complete change in culture, and I do not know whether that'll actually be possible. But I wanted to show Stephen in particular that I'm also, although I'm a practitioner and I go to all these meetings and produce my legal advice, I also read academic literature. And recently I found this article, interestingly published in 2018, that highlights all the various international challenges and threats the international community is facing across borders. And it is diseases and pandemics, greenhouse gas emissions. I've talked about this now, but there are so many others. Forests and other ecosystem, migratory species that move from one jurisdiction to another, rivers, oceans, of course, air and water pollution. And you've been talking about many of these issues as part of the lecture series. But then there's also organized crime, trafficking, smuggling, and so on. Of course, financial flows, currencies, trading, offshore companies. And, of course, intolerance, prejudice, racism, sexism, sugar. And these are ultimately the issues that led our forefathers and mothers to, after the Second World War, to create the UN and an international governance system that they thought might at some point have a standing army and turn into a bit of a world government. But I think, unfortunately, this pandemic has really shown us how far away we are, and that where there should have been strong international leadership and joint decision making, everyone's been doing his or their, probably his mostly, their own thing. And I'm not, I think that's maybe the big lesson to be learned for the future. There are attempts now to reform the WHO, the World Health Organization, but I think countries also need to look at the Security Council and reform of the whole UN system in order to be prepared and ready to deal with these international challenges. And if you want to get an idea about the notion behind the UN and why and what it is there to achieve and how it can maybe help us in the future to create a better world, have a look at that video. The UN has just turned 75. I don't think anyone's really been celebrating this, but you get this warm, fuzzy feeling when you look at the video. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Christoph. I think you've given us a lot to think about here, and you've brought us right up to date in terms of the UN climate process and some of the challenges it currently confronts with the pandemic. But you've also given us a broader framework to think about that often very technical UN process in the broader context of all of the bodies and all of the fora which are relevant to work on climate change. So I think that that's something that particularly those of us who work within the UN process should always bear in mind, that connection to broader realities. So as we turn to the question and answer section of the webinar, I thought I would just ask you, having told us about, perhaps, Christoph, if I could ask you to mute yourself while I'm speaking. I think that's creating a bit of a background, and I'm trying to do the same. So just to ask you, as you have described, the UN system has had to adapt to the pandemic. How has the work of the Legal Response Initiative, Legal Response International, changed this year? How have the demands on your work and how you've been responding to that change? I think that would be very interesting for our viewers to know.
I don't think for us as an organization, the world or the way we work has fundamentally changed, because we tend to work with lawyers, civil servants, and others in small developing countries. So we have used all the various platforms that there are in the past, and sometimes it's just a WhatsApp message or a telephone call. So I think in a way we might have benefited from people's willingness to go virtual now, because I don't really want to fly around the globe all the time. I think a lot of the younger lawyers we work with are also reluctant now. But for some reason, people still prefer the face-to-face interaction and the in-person workshop. So I think in that sense, there's been a development, and we're making good use of it, and it hasn't really affected our work. I think as a result of the cancellation of all the physical meetings, and Stephen, you've been to many of them, and you've also joined our team at some point, I remember. You know how important these physical or these personal exchanges are, and I think for a lot of civil servants in high positions, it's also sometimes a little challenging to say, actually, I didn't quite understand this particular interpretation, or can you advise me on how we should be doing this nationally? So there, I think a little bit of interaction is missing, and I think we're just human. We need that kind of interaction. But otherwise, we still write the papers we've written in the past. We produce training manuals. If you go to our website, you'll see that the little pocket guide on the Paris Agreement is available in PDF format, and we've also taken some of the components in that guidebook to produce little webinars explaining the content, in our hope accessible language. Otherwise, personally, I'm stuck at home in Southeast London. I would like to meet some of my colleagues occasionally, but unfortunately, you know, as of tomorrow, that'll be completely banned again. I'm not entirely sure what the rest of the year will look like, but we're all hoping that at some point this blows over and we can maybe not resume business as normal, but go to modus operandi, go to way of working that really makes good use of the technology and you know, only encourages physical contact when it's absolutely needed. So that's, you know, that's my suggestion, the light contact approach.
Yes, and just as I respond to that, I would like to invite anyone who does have questions to write them in to the chat box, including the public discussion box, which I can also see, and we'll be happy to take questions. But just in terms of the virtual way of work that has been forced upon us this year, I think it's interesting what you say about how LRI's work has continued essentially unchanged. And when we look at the UN climate process, it is such a sprawling process that sometimes we have to break it down a bit. And you mentioned that there is this large trade show-like element to it, where businesses, NGOs, and all manner of people come to the conferences and present what they're doing, or sometimes what they're selling. And then there is the work of the bodies, the committees, which have been created under the Conference of Parties, and that continues. And then there is the actual negotiations. So if the question becomes, what is robust to a transition to virtual or hybrid, and what absolutely has to be done in person? I've found it interesting this year that we've seen a lot of the climate action work, the stakeholder presentations, all of that is online. A lot of the official committees are doing work online, holding virtual meetings, etc. The negotiations, I think, are more difficult. I think it is a very different dynamic if you cannot have people in the room talking across a table, sometimes talking quite informally across the table. So I do wonder, and I don't think anyone has the answer to this, what the solution to that is, if the solution is not a vaccine and the world sort of returns to some semblance of normality within the time frame that solving the problem of climate change demands, which is not years into the future. How does one deal with the challenge of the modalities of work that the actual negotiation requires? So I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that question.
Well, I think the fundamental problem here really is that the decision-making process is archaic, that you have other international conventions, CITES, for instance, where parties actually vote and they press a button so that you know whether a new species goes on the list, whether a species goes on the list of endangered species or seriously endangered species. So there are ways of, I think, dealing with this situation quite effectively, but the decision-making process in the UNFCCC is really so much around this need to build consensus and getting all the big players on board, that that I think unless you introduce and finally adopt rules of procedures that allow for majority decisions, where you don't actually then, you don't need to bend over backwards again to accommodate somebody's specific needs, but you just take a vote and then run with it. I think without that political decision, it'll be really, really difficult to enter into a more effective mode of decision making. At least I don't see how that could be done. But adopting those rules of procedure is another incredible task, although it's a bit of a no-brainer for most people. If you go to an international conference and or if you negotiate a deal, you can quite easily do this with using Google documents and then maybe having a conference afterwards, and it shouldn't be that problematic. But I'm not. That's pretty much beyond my pay level, and I think it really needs a complete shift in culture as well.
Well, just on the question of voting and the absence of a rule book, it is interesting that the default operation of the climate conventions is on the basis of consensus. Now, consensus has not always meant 100%, and it's a difficult question to quantify what consensus is, but this is something we've seen time and again, including, by the way, in the adoption of the Paris Agreement, if you'll recall. That was not quite unanimous. Now, I do have a question from one of our viewers who asks, how detrimental is or will be the pandemic to the negotiations and wider climate action in terms of time robbed or time lost? So any response to that question?
I think it depends, and I think I have mentioned a few examples where, for instance, the introduction of the trading scheme of the International Civil Aviation Authority, where it's detrimental and where it has negative impacts. I think the jury, we still don't know what impact it'll have on the new NDCs that countries have to submit. I have attended quite a few of the UNFCCC informal meetings, and it is, I think, remarkable that at the moment, at least, all the countries, all the parties seem to make commitments to along the lines of these 6 principles put out by the Secretary General of the UN on a better green recovery. So they're all singing from the same hymn sheet, and they're all promising to take that into account when they recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. But there are also a few cases where countries have already been criticized for doing exactly the opposite. And I think that's, for instance, Brazil, Mexico, the US, Australia, India, who have been specifically supporting fossil fuel companies again in order to deal with the crises. So I think once we have all the scientific data on emissions during the pandemic and at the end of 2021, when there might be a vaccine, it'll be easier to say, but at the moment, I think we're largely speculating, aren't we?
Indeed we are, and I think that is a big question that hangs over the entire world: the degree to which the recoveries from this terrible pandemic will be green, will be sustainable. And I noticed in your presentation you mentioned the Article 21C of the Paris Agreement, which is one of the 3 Paris goals, and that, of course, is making finance flows consistent with a resilient future to adaptation and with climate mitigation. So the Paris Agreement has mitigation and adaptation goals, but also this very important goal to transform global finance flows. And if we're talking about not just government spending, but government signaling to the marketplace, then these pandemic recovery packages are some of the largest, not just spending programs, but signals to the broader economic community that we've seen in a very long time. And as you've mentioned, there is a great range in terms of how green, how sustainable these are to be. So this, of course, is not a question which is directly addressed in the negotiations themselves, but it seems to set a very significant framework for what is possible in the future. And of course, the other thing to note is that the recovery is a moving target. It's sad to say it, but as so many countries are suffering second waves and third waves of the pandemic, the economic crisis deepens. So we start to see some of the assumptions of market actors change, but also some of the very concrete budgeting decisions that have to be made change. So I don't know if you have any reflections on that point, on the question of Green New Deals and the potential for these recovery packages to push along climate action and try and bring the Paris targets a bit closer into reach.
I think I work with lawyers in the London city, bankers, insurance agents. I think you'll find that when you talk to them, and you might have made the same experience, there is an appetite to talk about green finance and to talk about how to change financial flows, and also to allow countries in the South to develop, to eradicate poverty, but at the same time to leapfrog certain development stages. So, rather than to build another high-speed rail somewhere in the UK or Germany, it should maybe be a high-speed link between Addis, Nairobi, but I think the governments are also, they need to create the regulatory framework, maybe, to make it more appealing, more attractive to invest in the South. And I think maybe this pandemic underlines the need once again. That is, I think, where the global North, the traditional earlier industrialized countries need to play a leadership role, and that would of course be an initiative maybe for the COP in Glasgow to strategically look at how investment can be channeled into the global South. The industry, to some extent at least, would be interested and I think ready to support this, but it also means potentially cuts in the North and maybe less economic growth in the North. So, politically, that's probably quite a tough one for a lot of politicians here in our part of the world, and Australia, of course.
Indeed, indeed, we can't forget Australia. Christoph, we have another question related to the pandemic. As each country is challenged by its own problems, like controlling the virus and revitalizing the economy, so how can the Alliance for Climate Action and Ambition be consolidated or brought back together? Very good question.
I'm not a natural campaigner, but I think that's probably exactly what is needed at the moment. And I have heard from friends in smaller countries in the South about all the initiatives around producing masks, cleaning the environment, you know, already respond jointly to the challenges by COVID and climate change. How we can do this maybe on a larger scale as civil society. I'm sure that the lawyers that have challenged mitigation commitments in industrialized countries based on human rights obligations could do the same around the recovery and hold governments accountable if and when they fail to take into account the need to be more sustainable and the need to take climate action in conjunction with responses to COVID-19. How we create that global mindset, maybe. You know, my response to that really is along the last two slides. I mean, it is a global world. We cannot build borders and make borders the dominant factor in international decision making. The fewer borders, the better. And then, you know, people can maybe move freely, a bit more than they used to. And, you know, we can collectively respond flexibly to the different challenges. Maybe that's, you know, a nice topic for one of the COP or one of your next seminars. You know, how do we create those alliances?
Yes, it's certainly a good PhD topic as well as a seminar topic. Christoph, the last question we received is one that I suspect a lot of people will be thinking about, and that is, what could be the influence of the United States withdrawing from the Paris Agreement?
They have withdrawn. I think the damage, the psychological damage, was done about a year ago when they sent the letter. I think a lot of people are also looking at this as an opportunity to create maybe a more stringent and robust international framework to address climate change. But you know, as of today, they're out of it. And if it stays like this, and if the new if there is a new Biden administration, if they then join again after he takes office, and he promised to make that one of his first acts in office, then I think we might be back in a situation where everyone's trying to accommodate the US. But if it stays as it seems, as it is at the moment, and they're out of it, then I think you know, there'd be leadership from other countries, and there might be new constellations. And I think, for instance, at some point, if we're really lucky, the EU might decide to take up arms against the US. I mean, that's of course a massive exaggeration, and put in place something like a border carbon adjustment process, that if countries that produce goods without taking into consideration the long-term impacts on the climate, then they also need to pay for that extra.
Well, again, thank you very much, Christoph. I mean, it's an extraordinary moment that we're living through. Someone I follow on Twitter wrote, I hope there will be an author who is equal to the task of capturing these times that we're living in and preserving them for the future, because it is an extraordinary moment, but also when it comes to climate change, a time of great decision. And that's why we've been very fortunate, Christoph, to have you here today to tell us about the UN climate process and the time of the pandemic, but also I think to give us some hope about the future and how the international community can continue to improve its collective response to climate change. And of course, negotiation between parties and states is part of that, but of course that's by no means the whole story. So thank you very much, Christoph Schwarte. And can I thank everybody who has tuned in for this first Law and Sustainability Colloquium. Thank you in particular for the great questions. And we very much hope to see you in future sessions. And let me just conclude by saying I wish everybody well. I hope that everybody stays safe. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.